In the glittering Budapest Opera House, a star soprano, Elena Kovacs, is stabbed to death on stage during Tosca's gala night, a prop dagger turned deadly. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster from Danefield, whose sharp eyes see beyond the glamour. As whispers of betrayal and ambition swirl among a charming count, a ruthless financier, a fiery conductor and a jealous understudy, Miss Marple unravels a web of love, greed and vengeance. A cryptic note reading traitor, a threatening letter, and a sharpened blade lead her to a shocking truth. One person's desperate dream turned a performance into a perfect crime. Will you follow the clues before the curtain falls? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Budapest. In the tranquil village of Danefield, where the seasons turned with gentle predictability, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her neat parlour, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of habit. The late autumn light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where a single letter lay, its foreign postmark a rare intrusion into her orderly world. It was from Lady Beatrice Harrow, a friend from her schoolgirl days, now widowed and living in Budapest with an enthusiasm for life that Miss Marple both admired and found mildly exhausting. The letter, written in Beatrice's exuberant hand, urged Miss Marple to join her for the gala opening of Tosca at the Budapest Opera House. "It's a spectacle not to be missed, Jane," Beatrice wrote, "and I insist you come. The city is alive with music and mystery, and I know your clever mind will find it all quite diverting." Miss Marple, though fond of her quiet routines, felt a stir of curiosity. She had never visited Budapest, and the prospect of its grand architecture and vibrant culture tugged at her sense of adventure. Besides, Beatrice's letters often hinted at intrigues, petty scandals or romantic entanglements among her cosmopolitan circle that piqued Miss Marple's interest in human nature. With a small smile, she folded the letter and decided to accept. A week later, her modest suitcase packed with sensible dresses and her favourite shawl, she boarded a train bound for the continent, her mind already turning over the possibilities of what lay ahead. Budapest greeted her with a crisp November breeze and the gleam of the Danube under a pale sky. Beatrice, resplendent in furs despite the mild chill, met her at the station with a chauffeur-driven car. "Jane, you haven't changed a bit," Beatrice exclaimed, her voice carrying the warmth of old friendship. As they drove through the city, Miss Marple marvelled at the elegance of Pest's wide boulevards and the fairy-tale charm of Buda's hills. The Opera House, a neo-Renaissance masterpiece, loomed ahead, its golden facade promising grandeur within. Beatrice chattered about the gala, mentioning a few names that would soon become significant. Count Laszlo Varga, a Hungarian nobleman with a reputation for charm. Elena Kovacs, the tempestuous soprano starring as Tosca. And Harold Grayson, a reserved British financier who seemed out of place among the artistic set. That evening, Beatrice hosted a small dinner at a riverside restaurant, its terrace overlooking the chain bridge aglow with lights. The guests included the aforementioned trio, each revealing a glimpse of their character under Miss Marple's unobtrusive gaze. Count Laszlo, with his dark eyes and impeccable manners, spoke of Budapest's cultural renaissance, but avoided questions about his family's declining estates. Elena, radiant in a scarlet gown, laughed too loudly and cast sharp glances at Laszlo, suggesting a history unspoken. Harold Grayson, nursing a glass of wine, answered questions about his investments in the opera with clipped precision, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an escape. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, steered the conversation to lighter topics, but Miss Marple noted the undercurrents. The way Elena's hand lingered on Laszlo's arm, the faint frown on Grayson's brow when the opera's budget was mentioned. As coffee was served, Elena excused herself to rehearse, her departure marked by a theatrical flourish. Laszlo watched her go, his expression unreadable, while Grayson muttered something about extravagant productions. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, said little, but observed much. In Danefield, she had learned that beneath polished surfaces often lay motives as tangled as her knitting wool. Budapest, she suspected, would be no different. Later, as she retired to her hotel room, Miss Marple sat by the window gazing at the city's lights reflected on the river. The gala was tomorrow, and with it, she sensed, would come a drama far beyond the stage. Her fingers resumed their knitting, the steady click of needles a counterpoint to her thoughts. People, she murmured to herself, are so very predictable, yet so very surprising. With that, she turned down the lamp and prepared for what Budapest might reveal. Chapter 2. The Gala Night. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her shawl as she settled into the plush velvet seat of Lady Beatrice Harrow's private box at the Budapest Opera House. The auditorium, a symphony of gold leaf and crimson drapery, hummed with anticipation as Budapest's elite filled the tiers. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the audience, their jewels sparkling like stars against the dark sea of evening attire. Beatrice, resplendent in emerald silk, leaned close to point out notables. A Hungarian diplomat, a Viennese countess, and a cluster of local artists whispering animatedly. Miss Marple, her grey eyes sharp behind her spectacles, nodded politely, but her attention wandered less to the finery than to the subtle gestures, the sidelong glances, the tightened lips that betrayed the human dramas beneath the surface. The orchestra struck its opening notes, and the chute curtains parted to reveal the stark beauty of Tosca's set, a Roman church bathed in dramatic shadow. Elena Kovacs, as Floria Tosca, commanded the stage with a presence that silenced the murmurs. Her voice, rich and impassioned, wove through Puccini's score, drawing gasps from the audience. Miss Marple, no connoisseur of opera but a keen observer of character, noted the intensity in Elena's performance, as if she poured some private anguish into her role. Beatrice whispered that Elena's portrayal was the talk of Budapest, her rise from humble origins to operatic stardom, a source of both admiration and envy. During the first act, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the audience. Count Laszlo Varga sat in a nearby box, his dark features illuminated by the stage lights, his eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that suggested more than casual appreciation. Harold Grayson, the British financier, was absent from his seat, though Beatrice mentioned he'd been seen pacing the lobby earlier, muttering about business concerns. In the stalls below, Maestro Istvan Balint, the conductor, led the orchestra with precise, almost furious gestures, his earlier argument with Eleanor, overheard by an usher and whispered to Beatrice, still lingering in Miss Marple's mind. The usher, a nervous young man named Peter, had hinted at trouble backstage, though he clammed up when pressed. As the interval approached, the air grew thick with anticipation for Tosca's aria, Visidate. Elena's voice soared, a lament of love and sacrifice, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman, whose passion seemed to transcend the stage. The curtain fell to thunderous applause, and the audience rose, chattering, to mingle in the gilded foyer. Beatrice led Miss Marple to a refreshment table, where champagne flutes clinked and gossip flowed. Miss Marple, sipping a modest cup of tea, overheard fragments of conversation. Praise for Eleanor's performance, speculation about her rumoured liaison with Count Laszlo, and murmurs of financial strain on the opera's production, tied to Grayson's investments. A young soprano, Anna Szabo, Elena's understudy, stood nearby, her smile tight as she accepted compliments that invariably mentioned Elena first. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a brief commotion near the staircase. Peter, the usher, was speaking urgently to a stagehand, his face pale. Curious, Miss Marple excused herself and approached, her unassuming air allowing her to blend into the crowd. Peter, catching her eye, hesitated before muttering about a row between Eleanor and Maestro Balint just before the performance. She called him a tyrant, he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. In her experience, tempers flared most when pride or ambition was at stake, and the opera house seemed a stage for both. The bell signalled the end of the interval, and Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind turning over the evening's undercurrents. Act de Secund unfolded with mounting tension, the plot's intrigue mirroring the unease Miss Marple sensed in the air. Elena, as Tosca, faced her lover's tormentor, Scarpia, with a defiance that felt almost too real. Beatrice leaned close, whispering that Eleanor's intensity tonight was unmatched, as if she were performing for her life. Miss Marple's knitting, a small bundle of wool in her lap, lay untouched, her fingers stilled by a growing sense of foreboding. As Act Thread began, the stage transformed into a stark castle rooftop, the dawn light simulated by clever lighting. Elena's voice rose in a haunting melody, but before the aria could reach its climax, a piercing scream shattered the music. The orchestra faltered, notes clashing discordantly, and the curtain dropped with a heavy thud. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by a stunned silence. The house lights blazed on, revealing a scene of chaos. Ushers rushing down aisles, a woman fainting in the stalls, and a low murmur of panic spreading like wildfire. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm. "What's happened, Jane?" she whispered, her face ashen. Before Miss Marple could respond, a stagehand appeared at the edge of the stage, his voice trembling as he called for a doctor. Moments later, Inspector Kovacs, a burly man with a grim expression, strode into view, followed by uniformed officers. The audience was instructed to remain seated, and a hush fell as the curtain parted slightly. There, illuminated by a single spotlight, lay Elena Kovacs, motionless on the stage. A jeweled dagger, intended as a prop for Tosca's climactic scene, protruded from her chest, its blade glinting cruelly. Blood pooled beneath her, stark against the white of her costume. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already at work. The dagger, she knew, was meant to be blunt, a theatrical illusion. Someone had ensured it was lethal. She glanced at Beatrice, whose hand trembled on her arm, then at the audience, where Count Laszlo sat rigid, his face drained of colour. Harold Grayson, now back in his seat, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Maestro Balint, visible in the orchestra pit, gripped his baton as if it were a lifeline. Anna Szabo, seated near the front, covered her mouth, but her eyes, Miss Marple noted, held a flicker of something other than shock. Inspector Kovacs addressed the audience, his voice clipped and authoritative. There has been a tragedy. No one is to leave until we have spoken with you." Whispers erupted, but Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze sweeping the scene. The opera house, so recently alive with music, now felt like a stage for a darker drama. She thought of Danefield, where village quarrels often hid deeper motives, and suspected Budapest's glittering society was no different. The scream, the dagger, the sudden death, all pointed to a murder planned with care, its roots buried in the passions and rivalries she had glimpsed tonight. As the police began ushering key figures backstage, Miss Marple slipped her knitting into her handbag, her movements calm but purposeful. "A dreadful business," she murmured to Beatrice, who nodded, still shaken. But Miss Marple's mind was alight with questions. Who had access to the props? Who had motive to silence Elena's voice forever? And why choose the stage where all eyes were watching? In her quiet way, she resolved to listen, to observe, and to unravel the truth hidden beneath the grandeur of the Budapest Opera House. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The Budapest Opera House, so recently a temple of music and elegance, now lay under a pall of suspicion as Inspector Kovacs and his men cordoned off the stage. The audience, still reeling from the sight of Elena Kovacs's lifeless form, was ushered into the foyer. Their murmurs a low hum of shock and conjecture. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back of Lady Beatrice Harrow's box, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap, her sharp grey eyes taking in every detail. The nervous fidgeting of a young usher, the rigid posture of Count Laszlo Varga as he was escorted backstage, and the peculiar calm of Harold Grayson, who lingered near the exit, his face a mask of detachment. Inspector Kovacs, a man whose broad shoulders and stern demeanour suggested a military past, took charge with brisk efficiency. His deep voice carried over the crowd as he announced that statements would be taken from key figures, performers, crew, and those closest to Elena. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and knack for blending into the background, was overlooked by the bustling officers, which suited her perfectly. She slipped into the corridor leading backstage, her small figure moving with the purposeful ease of someone accustomed to going unnoticed. Beatrice, still pale, followed her, whispering, "Jane, this is ghastly. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the evening. "Someone with opportunity and motive, Beatrice," she replied softly, "and in a place like this, both are rarely in short supply." Her thoughts turned to the jewel dagger, a prop meant for theatrical flourish, now a murder weapon. Its transformation suggested premeditation, a detail that intrigued her. In Danefield, she had seen how ordinary objects, a garden spade, a kitchen knife, could become instruments of malice when driven by human passion. Here, in the grandeur of Budapest, the same truth held. Backstage, the air was thick with tension. Stagehands stood in clusters, their whispers halting as Inspector Kovacs approached. Miss Marple lingered near the prop table, her eyes scanning the cluttered array of costumes, candelabras, and mock weapons. A faint glint caught her attention, and she bent to retrieve a torn scrap of paper wedged beneath a coil of rope. It bore a single word, scrawled in sharp, angry letters: "Traitor." She tucked it into her handbag, her expression serene but her mind alert. The word suggested betrayal, personal or professional, and Elena's fiery presence had clearly stirred strong feelings. Inspector Kovacs was questioning Maestro Istvan Balint, whose thin face was flushed with agitation. "Yes, we argued," the conductor admitted, his hands gesturing wildly. "Elena was impossible, always demanding changes to the tempo, the phrasing. She thought herself above the music." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in his tone, as if he feared more than professional criticism. When asked his whereabouts during Act 3, he claimed to have been in the orchestra pit, a statement corroborated by the violinist, but with a hesitancy Miss Marple found curious. Count Laszlo, next to be questioned, stood with the poised arrogance of his class, though his dark eyes betrayed unease. He insisted he had been in his box throughout the performance, applauding Elena's brilliance. "She was extraordinary," he said, his voice low. "Who would want to harm her?" Yet his alibi faltered when a stagehand recalled seeing him near the backstage entrance during the interval, a detail Laszlo dismissed as a misunderstanding. Miss Marple, listening from a discreet distance, thought of the glances she had seen pass between him and Elena at dinner the previous night. There was history there, she was certain, and history often carried secrets. Harold Grayson, when summoned, offered little. His responses were curt, his pale eyes fixed on the inspector as if measuring him. "I was in the lobby," he said, "avoiding the noise of the opera. I have no taste for it." When pressed about his connection to Elena, he admitted to funding the production but denied any personal acquaintance. "She was a performer, nothing more," he said, his voice flat. Miss Marple, however, recalled his discomfort at the mention of the opera's finances during dinner, and wondered what losses or threats Elena might have posed to his carefully guarded wealth. Beatrice, hovering nearby, drew Miss Marple aside. "Jane, this is dreadful," she said, her voice trembling. "Elena was not universally loved, you know. She was bold, ambitious, and not afraid to make enemies. Some said she demanded too much. Money, attention, even love." Her eyes flicked toward Laszlo, then away. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the understudy, Anna Zabot, whose tight smile in the foyer had hinted at more than professional rivalry. Ambition, she knew, could be as deadly as jealousy. As the police continued their interviews, Miss Marple wandered toward the dressing rooms, her steps slow but deliberate. Elena's room, marked by a star on the door, was cordoned off, but Miss Marple caught a glimpse through the open doorway. A vanity strewn with makeup, a bouquet of roses wilting in a vase, and a photograph of Elena with a young man torn at the edge. She made a mental note to inquire about the photograph, suspecting it might hold a clue to Elena's private life. A young stagehand, Peter, approached her hesitantly, recognizing her as Beatrice's guest. "You're asking questions, aren't you?" he said, his voice low. "I saw something odd tonight. Before the show, someone was near the prop table, fiddling with things. I couldn't see who. It was too dark." Miss Marple thanked him gently, her mind racing. The prop table, the dagger, the shadowy figure, each piece was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. As the night wore on, the police released the audience, but key figures were asked to remain available for further questioning. Miss Marple returned to Beatrice's side, her calm demeanour a contrast to the chaos around her. "What do you make of it, Jane?" Beatrice asked, her hands twisting her handkerchief. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles. "It's a puzzle, Beatrice, and puzzles have patterns. We need only find the right one. Back at her hotel, Miss Marple sat by her window, the lights of Budapest glimmering across the Danube. She took out the scrap of paper, studying the word traitor in the lamplight. In her quiet village of Danefield, she had seen how betrayal, whether of love, trust, or ambition, could drive people to desperate acts. Here, in the opulent world of the opera house, the stakes were higher, but the human heart, she knew, was much the same. She placed the paper in her handbag beside her knitting and resolved to watch closely in the days ahead. The truth, she felt certain, was waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the glances, the lies, and the secrets of those who had shared Elena's final stage. Chapter 4. Shadows of Motive. The morning after the tragedy at the Budapest Opera House, Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table in the Gerbaud Café, its opulent interior a haven of gilded mirrors and marble-topped tables. The aroma of fresh pastries mingled with the murmur of Budapest's elite, who, despite the previous night's horror, resumed their social rituals with determined elegance. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her usual vivacity subdued, sipped her coffee and recounted the city's whispers about Elena Kovacs. "She was a force, Jane," Beatrice said, her eyes darting to the cafe's entrance as if expecting an eavesdropper. "But forces make enemies, don't they?" Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, nodded thoughtfully. Her mind was still on the scrap of paper marked traitor, now tucked safely among her knitting. The word suggested a personal grievance, and Elena's bold character, as described by Beatrice, hinted at a life rich with entanglements. "People reveal themselves in their conflicts," Miss Marple remarked, her voice soft but probing. "Tell me, Beatrice, who stood to gain from Elena's absence?" Beatrice leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She spoke of Elena's rumoured romance with Count Laszlo Varga, a liaison frowned upon by his aristocratic family, who valued lineage over talent. "His mother, the Dowager Countess, was livid," Beatrice confided. "She called Elena a common adventuress at a salon last month. Then there was Harold Grayson, the financier, who had poured a fortune into the opera's production, only to clash with Elena over her demands for costly set changes. He was furious, Jane, said she was bleeding him dry. Finally, Beatrice mentioned Anna Sabot, the understudy, whose career had languished in Elena's shadow. Anna's talented, but Elena made sure everyone knew it. There was no love lost there." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her grey eyes scanning the café. She noted a young woman at a nearby table, her posture tense, her fingers drumming on a newspaper. It was Anna Sabot herself, alone and seemingly preoccupied. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her thoughts turning to the sharpened dagger. Its alteration required access, intent, and a moment of solitude. Details that pointed to someone familiar with the opera house's inner workings. After breakfast, Miss Marple persuaded Beatrice to accompany her back to the opera house, where the police had permitted limited access for the company to retrieve personal items. The grand building, stripped of its gala night splendour, felt cavernous and sombre. Inspector Kovacs was there, barking orders to a pair of officers examining the stage. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, drifted toward the prop room, where the jewelled dagger had been stored. The room was a jumble of theatrical relics, velvet cloaks, plaster statues, and wooden swords, but Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted a faint scratch on the table where the dagger had lain. as if it had been handled roughly. A stagehand, Peter, who Miss Marple recognized from the previous night, was tidying nearby. She approached him with a gentle smile, her manner disarming. "Such a dreadful business, Peter," she said. "You must see so much working here." Flattered by her attention, Peter relaxed, admitting he had seen someone lingering near the prop room before the gala, though the dim lighting obscured their identity. "It was odd," he said, scratching his head. "They moved quickly, like they didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning to the logistics of the crime. The prop room was accessible to cast and crew, but sharpening a blade required tools and privacy, details that narrowed the field of suspects. As she rejoined Beatrice, Miss Marple noticed Anna Sabo entering the theatre. Her expression a mix of determination and unease. Anna carried a script, but her eyes darted toward the stage, where a chalk outline marked Elena's final resting place. Miss Marple, ever observant, suggested they linger near the dressing rooms, where Anna soon appeared, retrieving a shawl from a locker. "Miss Sabo," Miss Marple called softly, her tone warm but deliberate. "You must be dreadfully shaken by last night." Anna started, her pale face flushing. "It's awful," she said, her voice tight. "Elena was difficult, but no one deserves that." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, noting Anna's trembling hands. "It must be hard, stepping into her role so suddenly," she ventured. Anna's eyes flickered with something, ambition perhaps, or guilt. "I've prepared for years," she said sharply, then softened. "I mean, it's my chance, isn't it, to show what I can do?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts on Anna's familiarity with the prop room, as hinted by Peter's earlier comments. Back at the cafe, Beatrice arranged to meet Count Laszlo for lunch, and Miss Marple, invited along, observed him closely. His charm was undimmed, but his laughter seemed forced, his eyes shadowed. When Beatrice delicately mentioned Elena, Laszlo's hand tightened around his glass. "She was a star," he said, his voice low. "But stars burn out, don't they?" Miss Marple, feigning interest in her napkin, noted his evasiveness. Had his family's disapproval driven him to desperation, or was his grief genuine? Later, as they strolled along the Danube's embankment, Miss Marple reflected on the motives swirling around Elena's death. Laszlo's pride, Grayson's money, Anna's ambition, each was a thread in a complex web. The word traitor gnawed at her, suggesting a betrayal deeper than professional rivalry. In Danefield, she had seen how small grudges could fester into violence, and Budapest, with its glittering facade, seemed no less prone to such passions. She thought of the photograph in Elena's dressing room, torn at the edge, and resolved to learn more about the young man it depicted. Was he a lover, a rival, or a clue to the killer's identity? As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to her hotel, her mind alive with questions. She opened her handbag, retrieving the scrap of paper with its accusing word. "Traitor," she murmured, her fingers tracing the letters. The opera house was a stage for more than music, she realized. A stage for envy, love, and vengeance. In her quiet way, she vowed to unravel its secrets, knowing that the truth often lay in the smallest details, overlooked by all but the most attentive observer. Chapter 5. The Count's Secret. The pale light of a Budapest morning filtered through the high windows of Count Laszlo Varga's ancestral home, a grand but faded mansion on the Buda Hills. Miss Jane Marple, invited by Lady Beatrice Harrow for a visit, sat in a velvet-upholstered chair, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. The room, with its ornate plasterwork and heavy tapestries, spoke of old wealth, but the worn edges of the carpets and the faint dust on the chandelier hinted at a family clinging to past glories. Laszlo, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, played the gracious host, offering tea with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Beatrice chatted about the view of the Danube, but Miss Marple's attention was on the Count, whose polished manners masked a tension she could almost feel. The invitation had come at Beatrice's insistence, a chance to cheer Laszlo up after Elena Kovac's murder. Miss Marple, ever alert to opportunity, had accepted, sensing that the Count's home might reveal more than his guarded words at the opera house. As they sipped tea, Laszlo spoke of Budapest's cultural heritage, his voice smooth, but his gaze distant. Miss Marple, with her gentle air, steered the conversation to Elena. "Such a loss," she said, her tone sympathetic. "You must have admired her talent greatly." Laszlo's hand paused on his teacup, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "She was unforgettable," he said, his voice low. "A woman of fire and spirit." Beatrice, sensing the mood, excused herself to admire a portrait in the hall, leaving Miss Marple alone with Laszlo. Seizing the moment, she leaned forward slightly. "It must be difficult," she said, "when someone so vibrant is taken so suddenly, and with such a scandal." Laszlo's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Scandal follows genius," he said. "Elena had her enemies, but I was not one of them." His words were firm, yet Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the armrest, a small betrayal of unease. Wandering the mansion under the pretense of admiring its antiques, Miss Marple found herself in Laszlo's study, where a half-open desk drawer revealed a letter in Eleanor's bold handwriting. The words were sharp. "You betrayed me, Laszlo, and for what? Your precious name?" The letter hinted at a business deal gone sour, one tied to Harold Grayson's investments in the opera. Miss Marple, careful not to disturb the desk, committed the words to memory. Returning to the drawing room, she gently probed Laszlo about his financial ties to the opera. His smile grew strained. "A gentleman supports the arts," he said. "Grayson handled the details. Elena, she had ideas, expensive ones." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the photograph she had glimpsed in Eleanor's dressing room, torn at the edge. Could Laszlo be the young man in it? She ventured a question about Elena's personal life, couched in her usual tact. "She must have had admirers," she said, her eyes soft but searching. Laszlo's jaw tightened. "Many," he admitted, "but my family, they have expectations. Marriage to a singer, however brilliant, was impossible." His voice carried a note of regret, or perhaps guilt, and Miss Marple wondered if his family's disapproval had pushed him to a desperate act. As they left the mansion, Beatrice confided that Laszlo's mother, the Dowager Countess, had once threatened to disinherit him over his infatuation with Eleanor. "She's a formidable woman, Jane," Beatrice said. "She'd do anything to protect the Varga name." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. A spurned lover, a family's pride, a financial tangle. Each was a motive, but none yet explained the sharpened dagger or the word traitor on the scrap of paper she carried. Back at her hotel, Miss Marple found an unexpected note slipped under her door, written in a hurried scrawl, "Leave Budapest, or you'll regret it." Far from alarmed, she smiled faintly, tucking the note beside the traitor scrap in her handbag. Threats she knew from her days in Danefield often meant someone feared her quiet curiosity. In her experience, fear was a close cousin to guilt. She sat by the window, gazing at the city's spires against the evening sky, and considered the players in this drama. Laszlo's charm hid a man under pressure, family, finances, and perhaps a broken heart. But was he a murderer, or merely a man caught in a web of circumstance? Her thoughts drifted to the other suspects. Harold Grayson's cold detachment suggested a man protecting his interests, but his absence during the performance raised questions. Anna Zabot's ambition was palpable, her resentment of Elena barely concealed. And Maestro Balint, with his fiery temper, might have snapped under the strain of Elena's demands. The photograph in Elena's dressing room, Miss Marple decided, was a thread worth pulling. She resolved to visit the opera house again, to speak with the stage hands or wardrobe mistress who might know more about Elena's private life. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched, her mind too busy with the puzzle of Elena's death. The Count's secret, whatever it was only one piece of a larger pattern. In Danefield, she had unravelled mysteries by listening to the small truths people let slip, and Budapest, for all its grandeur, was no different. The note under her door, the letter in Laszlo's study, the torn photograph, all were clues waiting to be stitched together. With a quiet determination, she turned down the lamp, certain that the truth, like her knitting, would take shape with patience and care. Chapter 6. The Understudy's Ambition. The Budapest Opera House, its grandeur muted under the grey light of a late November afternoon, buzzed with subdued activity as rehearsals resumed despite the shadow of Elena Kovac's murder. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Lady Beatrice Harrow, slipped into the auditorium, her modest figure unnoticed amid the flurry of singers and stagehands preparing for the next performance. The air carried a nervous energy, as if the company sought to reclaim the stage from the tragedy that had stained it. Miss Marple, her handbag clutched tightly, settled into a seat in the shadows, her eyes fixed not on the singers, but on Anna Zabot, the understudy now thrust into the role of Tosca. Anna's performance was striking, her voice clear and confident, filling the vast space with a passion that rivaled Eleanor's. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to nuance, noted the young woman's frequent glances toward the wings, where Maestro Istvan Balint conducted with his usual intensity. There was a tension in Anna's posture, a hint of something beyond stage nerves, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. In Danefield, she had seen ambition drive people to surprising acts, and Anna's sudden rise to prominence suggested a motive worth exploring. After the rehearsal, Miss Marple lingered near the stage, her unassuming air allowing her to blend into the background as Beatrice chatted with a costume designer. Anna, still in her practice gown, paused to sip water, her face flushed with exertion. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle, but her eyes sharp. "You were splendid, Miss Zabot," she said, her voice warm. "It must be quite an adjustment stepping into such a role so suddenly." Anna's smile was polite but guarded. "It's what I've trained for," she replied, her tone clipped. "Elena was a challenge to follow, but I'm ready." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It must have been difficult, working in her shadow," she ventured, watching Anna closely. The younger woman's eyes flickered. a spark of resentment breaking through her composure. "Elena had her way," Anna said, her voice low. "She made sure everyone knew she was the star. I worked just as hard, but she never gave me a chance." The bitterness was fleeting, quickly masked by a forced smile, but Miss Marple caught it, filing it away like a stray thread in her knitting. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the practicalities of the opera. "You must know the backstage well," she said, her tone conversational. "All those props and costumes, it's quite a labyrinth." Anna hesitated, then nodded. "I've spent years here, learning every corner. You have to, as an understudy." Her familiarity with the prop room, Miss Marple noted, aligned with Peter's earlier hint about her frequent visits there. The jeweled dagger, sharpened with deliberate intent, required such knowledge, and Anna's words placed her squarely in the frame. As they spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the torn photograph in Eleanor's dressing room. She had learned from a wardrobe mistress that it depicted a young man, possibly a former lover, though his identity remained unclear. "Did Elena have many friends in the company?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. Anna's lips tightened. "She had admirers, not friends," she said. "She could be cruel, you know, always pointing out my flaws in rehearsals." The admission, unguarded, revealed a personal wound, and Miss Marple wondered if it was deep enough to drive Anna to murder. Later, at Beatrice's suggestion, they visited a nearby cafe, where Miss Marple coaxed more from Anna over a pot of tea. The understudy's ambition was palpable, her dreams of stardom stifled by Elena's dominance. "I didn't hate her," Anna insisted, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's, "but I won't pretend I'm sorry she's gone." The words, blunt and unguarded, hung in the air, and Miss Marple's gentle smile belied the calculations in her mind. Ambition, she knew, could twist the heart as surely as jealousy or betrayal. That evening, Miss Marple met Inspector Kovacs at the Opera House, where he shared a new clue. The dagger's blade had been sharpened with a whetstone, likely smuggled into the prop room days before the gala. "It's no accident," he said, his voice grim. "Someone planned this." Miss Marple suggested examining the prop room's log, a record of who accessed it. The log, produced by a harried stage manager, showed Anna's name multiple times in the week before the murder, listed for set checks. When Miss Marple mentioned this to the inspector, he nodded, his eyes narrowing. "She's one to watch," he said, unaware that Miss Marple had already reached the same conclusion. As she walked back to her hotel, along the Danube's embankment, Miss Marple reflected on Anna's words and actions. The understudy's resentment, her access to the prop room, and her sudden ascent to the lead role formed a troubling pattern. Yet the note-reading traitor and the torn photograph suggested other layers to the mystery. Was Anna's ambition the sole motive, or was she a convenient suspect in a deeper plot? In Danefield, Miss Marple had seen how envy could simmer beneath a polite exterior, and Anna's guarded demeanour hinted at secrets yet to be uncovered. The threatening note slipped under her hotel door lingered in her thoughts, a sign that her quiet inquiries were unsettling someone. She opened a handbag, her fingers brushing the scrap of paper with its accusing word. Anna's familiarity with the opera house, her bitterness toward Elena, and her opportunity to tamper with the dagger made her a compelling suspect. But Miss Marple sensed the truth was not yet complete. The photograph, the financial disputes with Grayson, Laszlo's hidden letter, All were pieces of a puzzle that required careful assembly. As she gazed at the river's dark waters, Miss Marple's mind worked with the precision of her knitting needles. Anna's ambition was a powerful motive, but the word traitor suggested a betrayal that might point elsewhere, to Laszlo's family pressures, Grayson's financial losses, or even Maestro Balint's professional pride. With a quiet resolve, she decided to press further, to seek out the wardrobe mistress or stagehands who might know more about the photographed subject. The truth, she knew, lay in the small details, the unguarded moments that revealed the heart's darkest impulses. Chapter 7. The Final Act. The grand foyer of the Budapest Opera House, its marble pillars and gilded ceilings usually a stage for elegance, was now a sombre arena for truth. Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure almost lost among the towering columns, stood quietly as Inspector Kovacs gathered the key figures in Eleanor Kovacs's murder. Count Laszlo Varga, Harold Grayson, Maestro Istvan Balint, and Anna Szabo. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her face pale but composed, stood beside Miss Marple, who had requested this assembly with a gentle insistence that surprised even the stern inspector. The air was heavy with anticipation, the suspects' faces a mix of apprehension and defiance, as Miss Marple prepared to unravel the tangled threads of the case. She began, her voice soft but carrying the clarity of conviction. "Murder," she said, "is never a simple act. It is born of passion, calculation, or desperation, and in this case, all three were at play." Her grey eyes swept the group, noting Laszlo's rigid posture, Grayson's impassive stare, Balint's nervous fidgeting, and Anna's tightly clasped hands. Elena Kovacs was a woman who inspired strong feelings, love, envy, resentment, but it was the manner of her death, with a prop dagger turned lethal, that told me this was no impulsive act. Miss Marple drew the scrap of paper from her handbag, its single word, traitor, visible to all. "This was found near the prop table," she said, suggesting a personal betrayal. At first, I wondered if it pointed to Count Laszlo, whose letter from Elena accused him of disloyalty in a business deal. Laszlo's eyes widened, but he remained silent as Miss Marple continued. "The letter found in his study spoke of a financial arrangement tied to Mr. Grayson's investments, but betrayal in love, not money, seemed a stronger motive, and Laszlo's family pressures made marriage to Elena impossible. Yet his grief, I observed, was genuine, and his alibi, though shaky, held when a stagehand confirmed seeing him in the audience during Act 3. She turned to Grayson, whose cold demeanour had intrigued her from the start. "Mr. Grayson, your absence during much of the performance raised questions. You admitted to clashing with Elena over her demands for more funding, which threatened your financial standing, but your detachment suggested a man more concerned with protecting his reputation than committing a violent act. The prop room log showed no record of your presence, and your motive, while strong, lacked the personal venom of that word, traitor." Maestro Balint shifted uncomfortably as Miss Marple's gaze settled on him. "Your arguments with Eleanor were well known," she said. "Your pride as a conductor was bruised by her demands, but pride alone does not sharpen a dagger. Your presence in the orchestra pit during the murder was confirmed by multiple musicians, placing you beyond reach of the crime." Finally, she turned to Anna Szabo, whose face had grown pale. "Miss Szabo," Miss Marple said gently, Your ambition was evident from the moment I saw you perform. Elena's dominance kept you in the shadows, a frustration you admitted freely. The prop room log showed your frequent visits, listed as set checks, but one such visit, I suspect, was to sharpen the dagger days before the gala. Anna's eyes darted to the exit, but Miss Marple pressed on. The word traitor was a clever misdirection, planted to implicate Laszlo, whose affair with Elena you had discovered through gossip among the stagehands. You knew the prop dagger's role in Tosca and ensured it was lethal, counting on the chaos of the performance to mask your actions. Anna's composure cracked, her voice rising. "You can't prove that!" she cried, but Miss Marple's calm authority held the room. The whetstone, found hidden in a corner of the prop room, bore traces of metal matching the dagger's blade, she said, nodding to Inspector Kovacs, who had shared this detail earlier. And Peter, the stagehand, saw you near the prop table before the gala, though he didn't realize its significance at the time. Your resentment of Elena, your access to the props, and your sudden rise to the lead role all point to one truth. You saw her death as your path to stardom. Anna's shoulders slumped, tears welling in her eyes. "She humiliated me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every day she mocked my voice, my work. I only wanted my chance." Her confession spilled out, a mix of defiance and despair, as she admitted to sharpening the dagger and planting the note to cast suspicion on Laszlo. Inspector Kovacs stepped forward, his face grim, and placed her under arrest. The others watched in stunned silence as she was led away, her dreams of glory shattered by her own hand. Miss Marple stepped back, her role complete. The torn photograph, she now believed, was a relic of Elena's past, perhaps a lost love, but irrelevant to the murder. The threatening note under her hotel door had been Anna's desperate attempt to scare her off, a sign of how close Miss Marple had come to the truth. As the suspects dispersed, Laszlo's face softened with relief. Grayson nodded curtly, and Bolint muttered about resuming rehearsals. Beatrice, clutching Miss Marple's arm, whispered, "Jane, how did you see it all so clearly?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "People are much the same, Beatrice, whether in Danefield or Budapest. They wear their hearts in their actions, if you know where to look." The foyer emptied, and the opera house seemed to exhale, its stage ready to reclaim its purpose. Miss Marple, her handbag tucked under her arm, felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, though her thoughts already turned to the train that would carry her home. Chapter 8. A Quiet Departure. The chic Budapest train station bustled with the clamour of travellers, porters, and the low whistle of departing engine, as Miss Jane Marple stood on the platform, her modest suitcase at her feet. The late November sky hung heavy with clouds, casting a soft light over the city's spires and the shimmering Danube beyond. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her usual exuberance tempered by the events of the past days, fussed over Miss Marple's shawl, insisting she keep warm on the journey back to Danefield. "Jane, you've been positively miraculous," Beatrice said, her eyes bright with admiration. "To think you unravelled it all. Anna's scheme, the dagger, that dreadful note. I'd have never suspected her ambition ran so deep." Miss Marple smiled, her grey eyes gentle but alert, as they always were. "It's merely a matter of observation, Beatrice," she said, her voice soft. "People are not so different, whether in a village or a grand city. Their desires, love, ambition, revenge, leave traces like footprints in a garden. She adjusted her hat, a simple affair that contrasted with Budapest's elegance, and glanced at the train, its steam curling into the chilly air. The mystery of Elena Kovac's murder was solved, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the human frailties it had revealed. Beatrice, still marvelling, recounted the city's reaction. "The newspapers are calling it a scandal," she said, "but the opera house is determined to move on. Anna's arrest has set tongues wagging, and Laszlo, well, he's retreated to his estate, no doubt to appease his mother." She paused, then added, "Harold Grayson left for London this morning, muttering about cutting his losses. And Maestro Balint is already planning the next production, as if nothing happened." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. In her experience, life resumed its rhythm even after the darkest dramas, much like the seasons in Danefield. As they waited, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the clues that had guided her. The sharpened dagger, the scrap of paper marked traitor, the threatening note under her hotel door. Each had pointed to Anna Sabot's desperate ambition, but Miss Marple felt a pang of pity for the young woman, whose talent had been twisted by envy. The torn photograph in Elena's dressing room, she had learned from a chatty wardrobe mistress, depicted a childhood friend, not a lover. A detail that proved irrelevant, but reminded Miss Marple of the personal lives that often lay beneath public facades. The train's whistle sounded, and Beatrice clasped Miss Marple's hands. "You must visit again, Jane," she urged. "Budapest will seem dull without you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Dullness, Beatrice, is often a blessing," she said, "but I've enjoyed the music and the puzzle." With a final wave, she boarded the train, settling into a compartment with her knitting in her lap. As the city receded, its bridges and domes fading into the mist, she opened her handbag, her fingers brushing the notes she had kept as mementos of the case. They would join her collection of curiosities back home, small reminders of human nature's complexities. In Danefield, life awaited her. Tea with the vicar's wife, gossip at the post office, the quiet rhythm of her garden. Yet Miss Marple knew that wherever people gathered, there would be stories, secrets, and occasionally mysteries to unravel. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a familiar counterpoint to her thoughts, as the train carried her toward England. "People," she murmured to herself, "are always the same, and yet always surprising." With that, she turned her gaze to the passing countryside, content to let Budapest's drama fade into memory, ready for whatever puzzle life might bring next.